Nice seeing you all here. Saw a lot of you guys last night, so I'll try and not be too loud. Don't want to send you guys over the edge or anything like that. But welcome to Sunday at eVegas. Yeah, got a fun presentation for you. It's one of the things that I really like about EVE Online, just because I've been around so long. I kind of like I'm really into the history of EVE Online, and one of the funnest subjects is just kind of look at today, like the different ships that you would be flying in EVE Online based on kind of when you were playing EVE. So we have there's a lot of like a good history. Andy Groen has a really nice book, the history of EVE, and you can kind of read about all the political shenanigans that went on and what went on in Nullsec, Sov drops, and all that stuff, all the wars. But if you haven't been playing, you don't get to really see the ships that kind of made it all. So we'll start off kind of in the very beginning, not quite beginning, but 2003, 2004. I was preparing for this whole thing. I was looking at a lot of videos, a lot of YouTube videos. I gotta say, for the people that made YouTube videos for EVE ships or EVE content from 2005 to felt like 2009, everyone was using the same Skrillex song over and over again, so I got that stuck in my head. We're also going to gloss over wormholes a bit because honestly, I have no idea what wormholes even do now. So they're crazy, spooky people. But yeah, let's start at the beginning. In the very early days of EVE Online, a lot of people like to remember, kind of look rose-colored glasses at how fun it was, but it was janky. It was super broken, and it was grim. So there are no capitals, no battle cruisers, no destroyers. It was basically a rush to getting a battleship, and that was kind of the end game. You started off, you were in a frigate, you mined in that frigate. It looked something like that. You're in that ship, and eventually you got from the Imicus over there over to the Geddon because it had 8 height slots, 8 mining lasers. Yeah, that's the hotness right there. But yeah, so the very beginning, it was all battleships all the time. They were very much the end game content. They seemed super indestructible. If you went into Lowsec and you ran into a pirate and you were in your shiny cruiser, he was in a battleship, you melted, you cried, and then like that's 2 weeks worth of mining that you have to get back. So yeah, oops. The the very peak of everything, where you just saw a little bit over there, was the Cavalry Raven, which is a very fun ship, but there are other kind of fun little gimmicky things that you guys may not remember, but there is no really drone bandwidth on the Dominics. The Dominics just got 15 drones. So you just had 15 drones flying around, doing crazy stuff. The Thorax had 5 heavy drones. Nuts, did a whole lot of DPS. And wrecking shots, the old tracking formula wasn't really that good. So every once in a while you'd get like a perfectly glancing blow, whatever like that. And then 1 out of every 1,000 shots or so was a wrecking shot. And it did the max damage possible that your gun could do, like mathematically the top damage. And at the time, it didn't take into account tracking. So it would hit for perfect full damage no matter how fast the ship was going, no matter where it was. It just didn't matter. So a lot of the time, people just wanted all the damage all the time. And no one really had, there's no stacking mods. There's no stacking penalty for anything. So everyone really loved the Armageddon. The Armageddon had 8 low slots, which meant 8 heat sinks, which meant all the damage all the time. Gankageddons were a huge thing. They were like favored by everybody, second only to probably the Megathron, which was also 7 low slots, a lot of damage, but blasters. Everyone loved blasters because you just sat out the gate at 0 and just blasted stuff to smithereens, and it felt so good. And so a lot of the early PvP was just battleships melting through you. And of course, webs were 90% back then, so once you got webbed by a Megathron, you were not moving. But the most dominant, oppressive ship back then, at least in Lowsec and kind of like small gang stuff, not talking about big wars or anything like that, but this is the Cavalry Raven. So you can see the UI. It's a little bit fuzzy, sorry. No one took 4K video back then. Very rude of them. But this was definitely the most oppressive ship that you could encounter in EVE Online. I mentioned stacking penalties didn't work. That is true for micro warp drives, as you can see. That is not an afterburner and a micro warp drive. That's just 2 micro warp drives because, why not? Like, if one was good, 2 was better. Sometimes you could shove 3 on there. But what made this so grim to face is just the tactic that was around it, right? So you're sitting in your Raven. It's lumpy looking. It's weird. Some guy jumps into your system and he's not really sure what to make of you. You lock him up, start firing your missiles, and just charge towards him. And this guy just sees this lumpy ship lumbering towards him at like 20K a second. He's like, what's this idiot doing? Nothing's hit him. He's taking no damage. And so about 30, 40 seconds later, the Raven catches up to you, scrambles you, and then you get 5 volleys of missiles, 3, 4, 5 volleys of missiles hitting you all at the same time. That's because the ship was actually outrunning the missiles. So as you were getting closer, the missiles had a shorter flight time, so they're just stacking up in a queue. So you're sitting there in your ship, this Raven maniac is charging at you, you're not taking any damage, and then you instantly blow up. And then you're like, this is crappy. So yeah, that was the Cavalry Raven, and the very funny thing about EVE Online is the history of everything kind of repeats itself. The Theorycrafting kind of borrows from itself over time. So this isn't the first time we see the Cavalry Raven. This is when it's the most dominant, but the Raven will rear its head again in the not too distant future. But yeah, this is kind of what it would look like, right? So there are no ballistic controls either. So the lows were all power diagnostic units. No one thought to put nanofibers in there. They didn't care. Warp disruptor sensor booster, so you could lock out cap recharger 2s, and then twin mic warp drive, so you could run it all. And yeah, that's kind of what it looked like, and it was not fun. But now, if we look more like instead of just like solo small gang stuff, if we're looking at the big wars. It's all battleship dominated, just battleships all the time, and there are basically 2 types of fights. You would have sniper battleships firing at each other at like 150, 200 kilometers away, or you would have just remote rep close range battleships brawling it out. And so the scale was much, much smaller, right? So a 100-man fleet was huge back then. A lot of the fleets that you would see would be 15 to 50, somewhere in that range. And then for like the huge strat ops and stuff like that, it would then take off. But very early on, it was snipers and brawlers all the time. And there was really quickly going on, there was a big difference between the haves and the have-nots, right? So you can't really imagine it right now, but imagine an alliance that can't field a battleship because the players don't have the skill points or they don't have the funds. That was a reality. So the groups that started off early on, like in beta, and they were very comfortable with everything, and they knew the mechanics, and they all like had alliance reserves of battleship blueprints, which was huge back then. That's the equivalent of having like a capital blueprints. Those guys would just beat the crap out of everyone else, not only because they had the battleships, but they had the skills for it. They knew how to fly them, and there was another big disparity. Some groups had Tech 2 weapons, and other groups didn't, which meant that one guy could sit at 180 and shoot you, and then the other guy who would be, the other guy just couldn't touch you at that range because his equipment literally wouldn't make the way all the way there. And the Tech 2 BPOs, there was no invention at the time, so the people that had the blueprints hoarded them at an alliance level, and all the elite alliances at the time, like recruited corps that had these blueprints. So you're talking about groups like Mercenary Coalition, Band of Brothers, those big names from then. They would hoard these things. So if you're fighting them, you didn't have the ability. The only way you could get these two guns would to kill them and loot their wrecks. So that was pretty grim. Dregs and carriers played a role, but not too big of a role. They were very new. Again, very much all about sniping all the time. The meta for dreads was the last dread fleet to jump in would always win because they would, if you had brawling dreads, someone would come in with sniper dreads at 150 kilometers and just kill them all. So that's what we tried to do towards the end there in that era of dreads. So and a lot of the like the difference between the have and the have-nots. I have money moons on there. Promethium and Dysprosium at the time were built for, obviously they're for Tech 2 manufacturing, but there's a large concentration of them in the south of Eve, and so the alliances that lived there had a lot of that money, and ended up building a lot of the resources. And the difference in the wars back then is people would run out, alliances would just run out of battleships, and they would run out of funding for that. They'd just lose, like they just couldn't show up anymore. And it's weird to think about now, because that would never happen in like present day EVE Online, because everyone can just get ships pretty quickly. But then the haves and the have-nots were pretty bad. And then towards the end of 2006, we have the first Titans starting to appear in EVE Online, which we will break them at least 3 times in the next 10 years. So September 2006 is when the first Titan comes up. It's named Steve. It's built by ASCN. It dies to some enemy fleets, but these guys, if you played at all in Nullsec in the game, you would have your address book filled with every Titan pilot that you could find. When you see him log in, you would be immediately scared because yeah. And when we, if we're talking about the Cavalry Raven being really oppressive, there is one Titan pilot in particular at this time. He flew for LV, Latka Volterra, and if you were a goon in that time, you know him very well. It's the Enslaver in all caps, and yeah, Titans were busted. You kind of remember the meme where CCP were saying, "Oh, we think there's only going to be 5 of them in the game, so we make them real strong." So the Enslaver got his Titan. He was, I think, the 3rd Titan in the game, and he knew the mechanics of how they would work really well. Not everyone kind of knew how they worked because there was no manual. The only way you really knew how it worked was getting one, and that when you're talking about the entire population of the game with only 2 or 3 existing, no one really knew how it worked. But back then, the Doomsday was an AoE Doomsday that would basically wipe out any subcap on the field. It was super strong, very oppressive, and the reason the Enslaver was so very spooky is because in the very, very early days, when there were only a few of these, for some reason, someone thought it would be a great idea to allow the Doomsday to be fired remotely through a Sino. So he would sit outside of his POS. He would know kind of like the general area where a fight would be. He would have his alt in a Sino ship in like a buzzard or something. And when the fight would break out, he'd uncloak, light a Sino, Doomsday, and you're all dead. You don't get to see the Titan. You don't get to have a chance at killing the Titan. You're just dead. Also, Hictors didn't exist, so there's basically no chance of killing them. And it was very, very hard. I wanted to add some videos in here, but they were not that good quality because it's just the recording. But if you go on YouTube, and I'll have a list of this towards the end, and I'll tweet it out, you can hear Evil Thug trying to kill Celine's Titan, and the tactic they were using was to bump him. So you can have Evil Thug yelling, bam him, over and over again. It's one of the, if you guys remember Shadoo's armor hacks, before that, it was bump him. So yeah, those Titans, pretty bad. And then obviously, as people realize this, Titans alliances like pushed more towards Titans. They nerfed them a little bit by making sure that they had to go on grid. But even then, it was still really hard to kill them. And if you think about Titans now versus then, the way they fit them, they didn't put guns on them. That was absurd. If you put guns on your Titan, you were nuts. Because a dread just did more damage. So what you do is you'd fill it with all ice stabs and a cloak, so you could run away as soon as you light your Sino, or as soon as you light your Doomsday. So they're all like no tank, and the Ragnarok was king, and the Leviathan. Those 2 were the best because they had the most mid slots just for tank and utility, just in case you did get caught. But yeah, they were very hard to kill, and they were actually impossible to kill in Lowsec because, like I said, there are no Hictors and you couldn't put bubbles down there. So there are a few dudes If you guys played EVE Online, I'll remind you his name was Ginger Magician. He smart bombed Lowsec in his Nyx, and you basically couldn't kill him because, again, no Hectors. So, but now moving on a little bit towards the more civilized era, or at least a little bit more civilized and a little bit more balanced. We're gonna switch over to Lowsec and small gangs. There wasn't that much difference between those Lowsec and Nullsec when it comes to small gangs. People would roam around in Lowsec or they roam around in Nullsec. There was kind of did the same thing. There weren't like Lowsec dedicated groups so much. But because a few changes happened in the game, they introduced new ships, they introduced battle cruisers, they introduced rigs, and they started to loosen up what people were able to fly. It was no longer just battleships are king. There was a little bit more granularity in it. And so, and also people just want to try out new ships, right? And one of the new ships that came in was the Drake, which we will be seeing quite a lot of. People are very happy about the Drake. It's kind of an interesting way of how it became so popular. When you first started playing EVE, if you went into a new player group, they'd say, oh, you train Caldari to run missions, that's how you make your money, and then you run Minmatar, Galente, or Amar for PvP. That was very much Caldari missions, everything else for PvP. So instead of having to train all the way to a Drake, or all the way to a Raven, which has cruise missiles and stuff like that, you can skip that training time and hop into a Drake really early on. It's kind of like the modern day Vexor Navy issue. You could run missions in it, you can do nullsec stuff in it. And so every player, when they started, worth their salt, trained into a Drake, just because it made money. Wasn't used in PvP that much. Some people were tinkering with it, but the Myrmidon, the Cyclone, ships like that, the Ferox even, they were a little bit more popular. Also, there's like new playstyles that start to emerge. People really have a high value on roaming around. We're talking 50, 60, 70 jumps in your roam. And you generally always find some targets or some fleets. So instead of taking the lumbering battleships around, which take forever to warp and stuff, and are hard to maneuver, people started using long-range HACs. Fringe groups in like the big wars were using them before to like do guerrilla stuff, but this is when they really start taking off. And it's kind of like modern day Munins, more or less. But more or less people were using zealots and things like that. So you'd always see some sort of hack, and the zealot was, very definitely dominant there. One of the other things that was a really good force multiplier at the time and kind of super mega ultra unbalanced was ECM. So this is when the ships like the Falcon and even ships like the Blackbird really and the Scorpion would really start rearing their head. It seemed like for a long period of time, I think like an entire summer, it felt like everyone had a Falcon ult because you could sit them, like the range was 200 kilometers almost. So you could sit them at max range, cloak, and whenever a fight would go out, a Falcon would come out and unjam you, and it felt like they would always jam you all the time. There were no sensor skills, so every ship had a much lower sensor strength across the board. And if you weren't getting jammed, you were getting damped. Because damps, again, they didn't have scripts, so they were super, super powerful. They had the 50% scan res and the 50% lock range. And they were actually closer to 60 or 70%. So a lot of ships would take 2 damps in their mid slot, or 1 multi-spec or 2 multi-specs, no matter what it was. Galente ship, let's take some multi-specs and dams. Caldari ship, multi-specs and dams. Amar ship, multi-specs and dams. So you would see quite a lot of it. And it was incredibly frustrating because there was no counter to it really, because no one wanted to fit a sensor booster because everyone just wanted more stuff. So yeah, early on, a lot of like entry-level PvP, you could just damp a guy to about 22 kilometers, sit at 24, and kill him, and he can't even fight you back. So yeah, it was frustrating, and I think a lot of people have PTSD over over Falcons because they were just so oppressive at what they could do, and you could never really kill them. But another thing that happens is people realize that, hey, we can go fast again because of adding rig slots to ships. The Theorycrafters realized, hey, you know that time where we would fit 2 micro-warp drives on ships, we can kind of do that again with just one. So you have the polycarbon engine housing, which dominates the meta for at least 2 3 years. And you know, I kind of hate it. I loved it, but I hated it too. But that's what it looked like. And this is the Cavalry Raven coming back. It's got a kind of a different look. It doesn't have 2 micro-warp drives. It doesn't play exactly the same. DHB Wildcat, you've probably seen him before if you played, if you entered Nullsec. The Corp Bird Eden was kind of known for running these Cavalry Ravens. And so the tweaks that they made to the double micro-warp drive variety is they shoved a cloak on there, a bunch of sensor boosters, so they'd sit at like 200 kilometers and pop you before you realize what was happening. And they'd still charge in at you because they'd be able to go 5, 6K a second. Very agile like a cruiser, because of the polycarbons didn't stack with anything. And the low slots would be filled with nanofibers, and because Bird and Eden were jerks, they put warp core stabs in there, so even when you did catch him, they just warped off. And so this is when the Cavalry Raven becomes oppressive again. So you see it all the time in like small gangs. People try to emulate people like Bird and Eden because they were kind of like high-end PvP at the time. And yeah. Another thing that comes back, people just took this recipe that worked on the Raven and they shoved it on other ships. They're like, hey, if the Raven works, surely we can do it for other things. So the Typhoon, which looked like a trash can, and the Dami both became really, really popular because they had so many low slots. You could shove so many nanofibers and ICEBs in there with the polycarbs. They wouldn't stack. You're talking about a battleship that would go 8K a second, and it had so many heavy NOS, which worked like newts do now, and it would, so NOS were also broken. So NOS worked exactly like newts. No one used newts because it was insane to use newts. NOS would steal the enemy's cap, give it to you, and it would just always suck it down no matter what your capacitor level was. So the way it works now is if you have less cap, you get it, but then eventually it stops. But nope, these things were incredibly oppressive. And part of the reason is like you don't really need tracking for either the Foon because it's a missile boat, or actually a torp boat, and Damis were still using drones at the time, so you just see these little potatoes swinging around a target going 8, 9K a second, nuding you dry, killing you. And when I was researching this, I went back on the old forums, and people were complaining about it. People on the old forums would always complain about everything because there was no Reddit, so they needed some place to complain. And the comments looked like they could be right now. There was just a lot of, oh, it's easy to counter, just get good, man. But really there was no counter. The only counter would be like a Hugin or something, and the Hugin would get instantly NOS nuded out and killed. And if you had a couple Hugins, or if you had like a well-placed rapier, if you weren't paying attention to your NOS Foon, yeah. But again, these things wouldn't even die. They were just like, their lose condition was just not killing you and having to warp off. So that was fun. I didn't get killed by a whole bunch of Nostomies or anything, don't worry. I did. But yeah, and so people took this recipe and they said, hey, you know, instead of doing this on battleships, we could also do it on these HACs that we've been seeing around. And so this is when the Nano era really begins. You see Vagabonds, Ishtars, Sacrileges. Just shove one micro-warp drive on here, a bunch of agility mods in the lows that didn't stack with one another because CCP didn't learn their lesson about stacking the first time, so we gave them another excuse, and then the polycarbs in there. One of the annoying things about the rig slots, where there was only one size of rig, which is currently what would be large. So if you were flying like a Crow or a Vagabond or something like that, you would have to shell out basically 100 million ISK, which doesn't sound like a lot, but then it was quite pricey. So getting into one of these ships, it was kind of rat for a week, and then you can fly your Vagabond, and then someone kills you, you get real mad, and then you have to do it all over again. But this is when you see nomadic groups really start to use these ships. Like I said, they used it for roaming, very similar to long-range HACs. They'd go 70 jumps in one sitting and just go all around systems. They'd tackle a radar, wait for a defense fleet to come out, kill everyone. And these vagabonds and Ishtars and sacrileges, their loose condition, again, was just not dying. So it was very, very hard to kill these things. The EVE players didn't really have a good understanding of the meta or theory crafting at the time. Theory crafting was kind of like this very arcane thing that like a handful of people did, and you were like, whatever, it's my ship, I'll fit how I want it. So the home defense fleets in the beginning were easy to dumpster because they were very much kitchen sink fleets, and that's where the term comes from. Like the the fits just look like someone's kitchen sink. It's got a whole bunch of garbage in there. And yeah, you see groups like Triumvirate and Pandemic Legion really start thriving in this era because they can just do so much damage and lose so little. So it kind of brings that elite PvP mentality in there, and people always like killing stuff and not dying. So that's really it starts. And then this is kind of an era where people really start to flaunt their skills, right? So you have pilots that are doing really cool stuff like Kill2, who is now CCP Rise, Garmin, Knees Now, DHB Wildcat, Kenneth McCoy. These guys would make videos of their triumphs, and if you weren't a PvP or anything, you would watch these videos. They would put them on e-files, which was hosted by Kriba. They didn't even post it on YouTube. You'd have to go to like the thing and download it, and you'd watch these guys do crazy stuff, take on like 40, 50 people with 2 or 3, get a whole bunch of kills, and then really, people wanted to emulate that. And this is when it really first starts. Because before, no one took videos of themselves, so really, no one really knew what they were missing out on. And also, like, people didn't really perfect their fits at all. Like I said, theory crafting was still considered an arcane thing. People would fit really ridiculous things just to see if they could work, And you're talking about some of the best PvPers the game has ever seen, just doing goofy stuff. And some of the goofy stuff you can see here, that's like a laser thorax, a laser scorpion, and a normal maelstrom, but taking on like 15 dudes. And just to see what would happen. They weren't really afraid of losing. They weren't afraid of being made fun of, because it was like the badge of honor was, hey, I killed you in this really dumb ship. Ha ha ha! I'm that much better than you. So yeah, active tanking starts becoming a real big thing in the Lowsec meta and the like solo roaming meta. People think it's like it becomes very cool to be able to like active tank and manage that and bait people in real time. So the Maelstrom, Hyperion, Nightmare, Sleipnir, these ships all become really, really, really popular for people. Eventually, people the Lowsec meta turns from dual boxing with Falcons to dual boxing with logistic ships. You can thank Knees Now for that. He's the one that would have all of his alts around looking for targets. And when he would start losing, he'd either uncloak a Falcon, jam you and then warp away, or he'd uncloak a logistic ship, rev himself up to full, kill you and laugh and run away. But that's why he was able to do that with these kind of goofy ships. And now we're going to go back to Nullsec a little bit. These guys are still out there with their battleships, slugging it out. There were no... It's kind of like a weird era if you weren't there. It's hard to believe. There were no like fixed doctrines. When I say like people would take sniping battleships, it was, hey, you could take a battleship as long as it has long-range guns. We don't care if it's a Megathron, an APOC, a Tempest, just as long as it's a battleship. Come join the fleets. The idea of like you have to bring this exact ship for this exact role didn't play because the people at the time were like, hey, I mine for this ship myself. I bought this myself. I'm going to take my damn thorax if I want to, and you'll be happy to have me in your fleets. So the fleets back then weren't that choosy. So this is when we break Titans, really kind of the second time in the EVE's history. By then, from 2006 to 2008 and 2010, Titan proliferation became a big deal. Towards the end of the Big Delve War, the winning side had a celebration where they wanted to see how many AoE doomsdays they could light with all of their massive coalition, which was the entire north side of the map. All of them, and this is still from, it's kind of hard to see what's going on, but they fired all their doomsdays and ended up killing a carrier, a max tank carrier. So we finally reached the point where we had enough Titans on one side of the game that could AoE doomsday entire cap fleets. So Yeah, kind of broken, and this kind of led to some fun things. But before that, the way that people would kind of work around this for dealing with one or two titans is the meta was, hey, we'll just take guns off of our ship and take damage off, and just slap more plates on there so we can tank these doomsdays. And so you'd have like fleets that would have single doomsday tank, double doomsday tank, even triple doomsday tank. And to kind of kill these titans, people became very, very clever in what they're doing. People realized that you could take a flycatcher and get the best type of hardeners out there, and it could just barely survive one doomsday blast, enough to uncloak and launch its probe launcher and start killing them. So titans start dying, which is good, but they still start doing kind of a lot of damage. And now we fast forward up to 2010, which is kind of where I think EVE players realize that, hey, if we min-max our ships, we can get a lot of use out of them. And so in 2010, kind of the armor hack starts just showing up. And this kind of has a lot of implications because it completely changes how EVE players play, how fleets run. And a little bit of history about this. There's a Russian group named SOT. They're kind of still around, but they basically invented the idea of, instead of tanking my ship, I'll just have a very small signature so the guns don't hit me, because battleships were so big there and basically all the time. The idea was more or less laughed at. People were like, there's no way that would work. These things only have like 20k EHP. I looked it up. Well, there's no way you can go against a 100 EHP battleship. You're crazy. But SOT proved that they could do it. PL kind of borrowed the idea, refined it, and made it their own, which is what we did for quite some time. We just stole it, made it look a little bit better, slapped some lipstick on it, and then claimed that we made it up, but whatever. And this is another thing that dramatically changes how EVE is played. It's where having a fleet anchor becomes a thing. Before it was you align to a celestial, like you align to the sun, or you align to the bad guys, something like that. But never before had you orbited an FC. Like, this is the first ever time, because transversal velocity was very important to taking very little damage. So it was important that all these ships started orbiting each other, and this is where like the fleet anchor role really becomes a thing. The very early armor hack fleets, people, like, if they weren't familiar with them, they had no idea how they worked. You'd describe it, and they'd be like, oh, so you just orbit the gate all the time? Like, no, you have to orbit this one guy. They're like, why this one guy? Why don't we just orbit the gate? And so you'd see a lot of people trying to emulate this and then dying just because they had no understanding really of how it would work. But yeah, so this combination of high speed and low signature took New Eden by storm. People, kind of try and figure out how this works. They try and break it, but really it just takes a while. And because it becomes so oppressive, that's where people start to really, really value the idea of theory crafting and coming up with counters. And this is, if we were to be objective about it, I think this is where goons break the game for the first time, really. They're kind of the first big group that popularized the idea and make it mandatory to have a strict doctrine, right? You have to, if you're in this fleet, you have to fly this one type of ship for this fleet, and that's it, and we're only gonna leave when we have this ratio of ships. So if you want to fly your own thing, get the hell out, go join someone else. And what they did is they tied this to SRP. So if you flew any other ship, you would get no money. And very quickly, people were starting to get in line. And this is where, the old alliances were starting to die off because they didn't adapt to this, and goons just pushed it to the next level. Towards the end of or the middle towards end of 2010, it took that long for people to come up with a counter to Drakes, or a counter to armor hacks, and it came from one of the most unlikely of places, this dumb little Drake that people were using for PvE and PvE only. People kind of found this out by accident. Some of the early defense fleets would take Drakes out because they were easily replaceable, and they were very cheap. And so alliance leaders would say, yeah, just take Drakes out. And eventually they realized that they could kill these zealots and guardians because they could just, they didn't care about the tracking. They were just using missiles. And if you get like one web on it, then the guardians start dying. And so finally, Eve figures this out, and the Drake rises to dominance for, I have it on there for a year, but it's really like 3 or 4 years where it's super, super dominant. They're very easy to FC. You get the idea of orbiting a fleet anchor now with armor hacks. So you do the same with Drakes. Excuse me, you have your micro warp drive running. It's got insanely high alpha from like a very small package. They're very cheap. They're replaceable. And even like really seasoned groups were using them. It wasn't just like newbie FCs. Evoke, and then the Pod Liberation Authority, or Podla. You guys probably still have a Podla Drake sitting around. They very much popularized it. And just a little tidbit, a little note is because they became so popular, every alliance in the game was running Drakes. Turns out missiles create a bunch of lag, so CCP had to stop what they were doing, fix the lag, and in the middle of that, it somehow fixed a JITA node and made JITA less laggy. So thanks, Drake, for everything you've done. I hate you, but still. And then this is this is where things get a little wild. It's like an arms race of theory crafting. So you have armor hacks that get countered by Drakes, and then people are like, oh, what do we do against these Drakes? And then people realize, actually, CVA is the group that realized this first, because they're a role play group, so they were flying Abaddons, and all of a sudden you would see a whole bunch of dead Drakes, and the Abaddons would still be alive. So we're like, maybe these role players are onto something. So again, we took the idea, threw some lipstick on it, and claimed it was our own. But this time we gave it a very dumb name, and it's kind of a naming scheme that Doctrines will be named for the next half decade. And it all became because Shadu was watching this teen dramedy series on the CW about cheerleaders, and it was called Hellcats. So he was like, I want to name these ships Hellcats, and Shadu could do no wrong, so there we go. We have Hellcats. And then, like I said, it launched a whole thing, and there are some really, really fun videos where people kind of figure out the counters to Drakes, and this is one of my favorite stills. If you see the guys in red are in Drakes, and the guys in purple, they have one guy out front that looks like he's out of position. He's just smart bombing, and literally everyone else is not getting hit by a single missile because all the missiles start dying. It's called firewalling. Initiative came up with this idea in the very beginning, but we stole it, and because we were way cooler, Pandemic Legion took credit for it. But so yeah, there's so much back and forth, a lot of rock, paper, scissors going on. In fleets, it was very much, there was an advantage to the smaller groups because they could form faster. They would counter whatever you had. So it's like, if you take paper, I'll take scissors, but because it took you an hour to form up and only me 30 minutes, I've got the edge. And then the last gift of Seamus, the executor of Pandemic Legion, he realizes that, hey, you know what, these armor hacks we're doing, they've got some drawbacks, but if we could put a little bit more tank on them and give them more range, they would be like basically unstoppable. And he couldn't find a hull for it, and then he was like, hey, what about these Tech 3 ships that just came out? No one was using them for PvP. It was considered insane. They were very, very expensive. And yeah, we'll get to that in a little bit. I get ahead of myself. But yeah, this is when, as I mentioned, this is when goons start to break Eve. This is the Alpha fleet, and we'll have to skip through this a little bit, unfortunately, because I like to ramble. But this was kind of a big deal because it was a very tanky hull that could survive a lot, and they were very, very good at killing key targets. There's a very high skill cap on FCing, so Mr. V, he made it look very, very easy, but he would just decimate people, and anyone that tried to emulate them would quickly find themselves outflanked and outfoxed by the cunning man. So yeah, but like I said, this is the first time that cohesive doctrines are used. And then, ta-da, we break Supercaps again. Doo-doo. There are actually some really funny ways that we broke supers. We actually had so many of them that the POS mods that would sit outside of the force field, they were never meant to be destroyed unless the POS was offline. So CCP gave them like 99.9% resists. But we had so many of these Supercaps that we could just do that 0.1% of the damage and kill the mods as they were online on the tower. Super broken. And tracking Titans also became, this is where people realized, like, hey, people are flying battleships and these very lumpy drakes. I can take my Titan and put some guns on it and just hit these things perfectly. So tracking Titans became a really, really big thing. Pandemic Legion. This time we didn't steal it. We did our own. But we did it so good that they nerfed them into the ground. And there were some fun broken mechanics of that. But now going back to the Lowsec a little bit, just to take a little gander at what's going on over there. It is getting way, way more granular and very, very different and very diverse. People are really flying battle cruisers all the time. They're cheap and easy to get into. They've got so much utility. They can do everything. So Lowsec and some Nullsec areas are just littered with battle cruisers and battleships. Frigates were kind of garbage. Destroyers were fun, but very limited in what they could do. And these things were very, very heavily favored. Again, people kind of realized how to break the game really, really well. This is the era of when Theorycrafting was a big thing. And there's a gentleman up here, Muck Brovian. I will blame him for breaking the game because he realized that you could take a battleship afterburner, shove it on a cruiser, and you'd get micro-warp drive speeds and still your tiny signature. And yeah, so finesse becomes a big thing because the ships are not very maneuverable. So there's, again, a very high skill cap to moving them around. Yeah, so Muck broke that. Thanks, Muck. They were incredibly terrible to deal with. And because he was so good at it and because they became so popular, alliances started using them on a big level. And Against All Authorities, AAA started using them. And we really had no idea how to counter them because they were like drakes on steroids that you just couldn't hit. And eventually, we kind of came up with this idea of using a Navy APOC, which was kind of ludicrous at the time because it does very little damage, but because of its ability to track, it can kind of do quite a lot, and it ended up becoming a very good counter. It's when people realize that just because a number in EFT looks really good doesn't necessarily mean jack. It's way better to have your ship actually applying damage and actually getting hits rather than a theoretical damage of what you could take. So this lower damage ship that would always apply became very, very popular and a very good use. And then we break the game again with supers in 2012. Very sorry for this, by the way. We completely broke the game. We realized, hey, these carriers, what if we just shove a bunch of them together? And then we can throw out 15 drones each and assign them all to one person, and that one person could just kill literally any ship. You don't need to have coordinated volley. You don't need anything. You just sit there, and one guy pushes a button, and every drone on the grid shoots some guy. So yeah, so we took that, and then the reason that they became so big and so popular is because to combat them, you needed a really disproportionate response. Again, very similar to the Nano age. The counter was just not dying to them and ignoring them and just hoping they go away. You didn't really have a chance to kill them. There were some theoretical counters. Vili came up with Omega Fleet, which is just a bunch of sniper Nagelfars, but the amount that you would need to actually do it turns out breaks the server, so it never actually worked. But this led to fights like BTAC-R and HGP. So giant bloodbaths because capitals become a really popular thing. And then we take this idea and we kind of evolve it even more, turn it into bringing Titans and Supers along with it. One of the main issues at the time was when you sinoed in a bunch of Titans, they'd bounce around, and the guy that comes in last would probably bounce around 80 kilometers and come to his demise. But we came to a solution with that by just having a swarm of carriers on the outside, so the Titans would ping pong into the carriers, knock a carrier out there, who cares about that guy, and he'd come right back into the center. So yeah, that broke the game for like 2 years. Sorry again. And then as that gets nerfed and that gets tweaked a little bit, Eve decides to change it up again. They go to the Rail Proteus and the Rail Tengu. Again, the idea of the Thundercat, which kind of was super overpowered, which was the the HAC, but with the Tech 3 destroyer or cruiser hull. The Rail Proteus at the time was super popular. It was versatile, very beefy, very tanky. You could take up a beating. It could go up against battleships. It could go against smaller stuff. Really didn't care. Again, we're going to the idea of applied damage that actually hits your target rather than just an EFT number. And Rail Tengus become big. And then for a while, battleships, people were just like, hey, let's just fly battleships. That'll be fun. And so there's just like a year of Macarials, because people were just like, yeah, we really like the Macarial. And it turns out it's a good ship. A few balance passes made battleships a little bit more viable. And the Macarial was, very, very much into the fray. And then we kind of have to speed up a little bit. You guys probably remember the memory is a little bit more recent, but I thought it was a little fun that the Cavalry Raven comes back once again. This time, no one steals it from initiative. They do it themselves. Turns out you could take these Ravens, shove an MJD on them, and they're kind of very reminiscent of the Cavalry Ravens of old. They're just zooming around you and pinging with missiles, and you don't kill them. Add in the command destroyers, and these things just don't get caught, and they kill you. And they're probably sad right now because only 25 of them can take the trip. But this is kind of like the third era of the Cavalry Raven. It's still kind of popular to this day, so you still got it. I have no doubt that they're going to be nerfed and then come back in 5 years some way. But yeah, so we had to skip through a little bit, but do we have any time for Q&A or not so much? All right, if you guys have any questions or if you want to talk about some things about ships, as you can tell I'm super passionate about it, so you can just grab me in the hallway and we can talk ships for a while. But yeah, thank you so much for coming. Hope you have a good rest of your day. And yeah, thanks.